Hello everyone, welcome back and welcome to the new members of staff that are joining with us, both members of staff who are brand new to the school and members of staff that are returning. So teaching and learning in 2020 is going to be a very different experience to what we've come across in the past and what we've been used to. And today's session is all about looking at our priorities for the next year or so. Now, obviously, I spent a lot of time in school over the lockdown and met with lots and lots of youngsters. And the overall experience was very, very positive with those key worker children that were coming into school and those pupil premium or identified pupils that were coming in. It's really, really important that we welcome all of our youngsters back and in fact welcome our whole community back to us in school. There are lots of new routines that we need to establish. We need to reassure those people amongst our community that need reassurance. So the use of positive language is really, really important when we're talking with members of that community. And we're going to need to remember that we're going to need to review and regularly reinforce our routines. Now, there's lots and lots of scientific research about whether we use positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. And I think my experience and the experience of a lot of people around the school is, in fact, that positive reinforcement of rules would be a much better experience for people and likely to cause those long-term changes in behaviours. So, new routines, what's going to change? So the first thing is, unlike what we've experienced in the past, the chances are that the majority of teachers, we're going to be nomads, we're going to be moving around an awful lot. So in normal teaching classrooms, the youngsters are likely to be there before you and are going to be sat in the room. Now, Andy and the pastoral team have been working at what is actually done by the pupils while they're in between lessons. The chances are, if they're Key Stage 3, 7, 8 or 9, that those youngsters are likely to be spending some time on literacy and silent reading tasks. If they're 10 and 11, it may be that those literacy tasks move toward revision card production. But the expectation is that those youngsters are engaged in some way. So we walk into the classroom, and unlike previous years where we might meet them at the classroom door, they're already there. So we're going to need to find a way of formally starting the lesson. So I would ask, please, that we ask our youngsters to stand. We formally greet them as a sign that the lesson has begun, and then begin the lesson from there. And that's really, really important to get that formalised start, to get that routine back into play. Other suggestions, if you are a year 7 or 8 pupil, the chances are that you have been sat in your same teaching room for long periods of the day, because remember, it's the teachers that are moving rooms, not necessarily the pupils. So we're going to need to perhaps reintroduce brain gym activities. Now, the presentation that I'm giving now, I've put some links in here. So if you click on the brain gym that's underlined, I've given you some ideas of some physical tasks that could be done. And they don't need to be any more than a minute worth of activity, but something that gets the youngsters to stand up, that gets them to do something which is going to re-engage them in the lesson, re-engage those brains, really get the synapses flowing and start to get blood pumping around the body as well. If anyone happens to bump into Alan Thompson, ask Alan Thompson about some of the brain gym activities that he has. He has some great little sequences that he does with people's fingers where they have to follow different sequences and different challenges, and he can show you those tasks as well. The other thing that we're going to need to do, we're going to need to recognise that retrieval tasks become really, really important. And it's not just retrieval tasks from what we taught last lesson or last week, but these retrieval tasks are going to have to keep going back over the content that was covered last year. Particularly last summer, so from March onwards. But remember that we're reviewing that content, we're pulling back that information, and we're using it as a method to try to judge and make decisions on how much the youngsters have learned. The lesson content itself Now, it may be that you spend some time introducing the new content, teaching the new content from the front, or it may be that you are choosing as a member of staff to be more reliant on flipped learning. Now, the reason that I refer to flipped learning as opposed to just new content all the time, we are going to need to recognise that some youngsters and some students are not going to be in our classroom. So we're going to be heavily reliant on our new systems. We're going to be heavily reliant on things like Google Classroom and Google Sites in order to make sure that all of our youngsters have got access to information. So that's really, really important that we set up Google Classrooms for each and every one of our class. And we recognise that any content that's delivered perhaps needs to be placed into that classroom. An alternative is to create a Google site where you're keeping all your lesson content. I know that's the way that I used Frog in the past, and certainly have been spending some time over the summer moving to Google Sites to make sure that all of my lesson content is there on Google Sites for my learners. Review of learning later on in the lesson. Any new content, any flipped learning that takes place, again, we need to regularly be reviewing that. So we're going to need those retrieval tasks later on in the lesson as well. Then at the end of the lesson, it's important to recognise that unless it's a break time, unless it's morning break or it's lunchtime, that there are going to be no bells. So keeping your eye on time is really, really important. But at lesson changeovers, it's important that we stand the pupils up as we did at the beginning of the lesson. We say farewell to them at the end of the lesson. Just reinforce again what any homework might be from the lesson. And we ensure, please, if we're the teacher leaving the room and it's a changeover in lesson, that we're asking those youngsters to get out their reading books or revision cards, depending on what's been set for them and what you've been asked to be set from them from the pastoral team. But you set the work as the teacher leaving the lesson, and you leave the class so that the class is ready to go for the next lesson. The teacher arrives and they're sat in silence, or they're doing their task, their reading task. Now, we're introducing this programme, and I really want to thank the faculty coaches for their work on this, and particularly Carolyn Sims-Evans, who spent an awful lot of time working on this over the summer, on our programme for coming back called Map, Master and Move Forward. And the language that we use is really, really important. So you'll see now that in front of you that the type of language that we need to be avoiding as a teacher, as a member of staff, in fact, is really, really important. And you'll notice that things that we need to avoid are things like catching up, we've got behind, we need to make up for the time that we've got lost. And that's the type of language that we need to avoid. And despite the fact that we might be feeling a little bit nervous about the situation or anxious about the situation because we perhaps haven't had clarity from the government in terms of what's happening next year in terms of exams and whether those exams are going to be later, whether we're going to have to fit in the whole curriculum. It's important that we put that mask on, that we are always being positive with the learners that we have as much as possible. So please, I would ask you to look at the type of language that we're using. So deepening knowledge, building upon, enhancing the information that we already have, consolidate and strengthen the prior learning that we have. So that use of language is so important. The use of praise, the use of humour as well within the lesson is very, very important. It was interesting watching some of the interactions that took place over the summer months. One thing that I would say to all staff is that when we come back, there are going to be youngsters that have not been in a routine for some months, and being pragmatic about the instructions that we give and how quickly those instructions are followed is really, really important. We've done some work in the past with releasing potential, and we talked about the use of language and finishing our instructions with please, thank you. And that pause between please and thank you at the end of your sentence is really, really important. Then stepping away and giving the youngster time to respond to that instruction is important. it's going to be important for our own mental health. We're going to be under a lot of pressure. We are being asked to do lots of things that we haven't done previously as teachers. So that use of language is going to need to be something that's practiced over and over and over again. So the new program, Map, Master, Move Forward. You'll notice that I've placed a link here on the presentation that will take you to all the documentation that we have in place. This is very much based on a research approach, and the document that's in place has got lots of information in it about how that research has come about, the types of things that we need to have within our lessons, and the fact that we don't lower our expectations at all. We have very high expectations as a school, and certainly we generally achieve all of those expectations as well. But the research and the information is there for you to have a look through. It's not a checklist that's there to say to you, you must do this all the time. If it's just easier for you to remember these terms, Map, Master, Move Forward, then fine, stick with the Map, Master and Move Forward. If you're wanting to see the research behind it, if you're wanting to understand how we've come about this particular program, then by all means read through that. There are some suggestions on there to you about what we need to do in Key Stage 3, what we need to do in Key Stage 4, and in fact Key Stage 5 as well. So bear that in mind when you're reading through that document. So what do we mean by MAP? So heads of faculty since about, I don't know, January, February time, have been working on mapping their curriculums and looking at what comes into their curriculum. Now this might seem a little bit complicated what I'm going to show you, but here, for example, is my Key Stage 5 map for my A-level PE class. Now on my Key Stage 5 map, I've mapped in my physiology, I've mapped in my psychology and skill acquisition, and I've mapped in my contemporary issues. Now all of this are all of the topics, everything that would be covered over Key Stage 5, and I know that this is where I should be delivering them. However, I know from last summer that a number of those activities may have been affected by the fact that we weren't able to deliver things. So I can immediately identify on my map what were the topics that weren't covered. In addition to that, types of things that I'm going to do is I'm going to need to check mastery. And how do I check mastery? And how do I check whether youngsters have learnt that information? Well, it may be that I'm using a map, or I'm using a sequence for pupils to identify how well they've understood a particular process. So this is my A-level exam. This is everything that my youngsters need to know about the cardiovascular system, which is physiology, and I'm asking them to rag their understanding, red, amber, green. Okay, so what do the youngsters understand? What do they think they know? On top of that, other information that's going to help me know and map and judge how well things have been mastered are my individual mark sheets. So for example, I'm going back to my class list, I'm looking at the time that youngsters have spent on stuff, and incidentally this particular sheet that I'm showing you here is all about variable seating time for me, which is a form of differentiation that I use and I'm quite happy to talk to members of staff about. And I can see where the gaps are in knowledge. The other thing that my individual mark sheets are going to be telling me is they're going to be telling me test results, marks for individual assignments. So I'm going to be heavily reliant on those, as well as the information that I'm gaining from retrieval tests. Some members of staff may choose to set topic tests when you return. But I think it's important that we're really encouraging with our youngsters, rather than them seeing this big dark cloud on the horizon that's exam straight away, that we build into that gradually, we build into that gently. If we think about our Year 11s didn't sit any exams last summer formally in school. It may be that those exams that they normally sit in November time move because of the external exams, but there'll be more information coming in on that later on. We are going to need to think very carefully about our assessment program. Rosenshine says this on review material and retrieval material: a major issue in learning is the inevitable, predictable a natural process of forgetting. Unless we review what's been learned, our memory of that information diminishes. And it's so true. If we can keep moving back to information, we're going to start to affect the forgetting curve. We're going to start to impact on the knowledge that we are able to retain. So it's really, really important, these daily reviews, these weekly reviews, these monthly reviews of all of the work that's covered within our courses takes place. Moving back to mapping, lots of syllabuses may well have been tweaked over the summer, and I know this is something that QCA and the individual exam boards will be looking at as to whether it is full content that's covered in Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 exams. For example, I know that history has been affected and that history has had a number of its topics either shortened or taken away. However, in my particular subject, I know that everything still stands. So it's important that those maps are regularly updated, that we're looking at those maps and they become an everyday tool for us as teachers, so that we can check on what needs to be delivered throughout the year. So I was thinking really carefully over the holidays. So that tells us about the programme moving forwards. We have this picture in life that we need to look at, and as teachers we'll often find that the picture is blurred for youngsters. We need to give them the tools to be able to see the whole picture, and this particular image that you see in front of you now is about our individual learners, and you'll notice that all the individual learners, they're very different to one another. They come from different starting points, they come from different levels of ability, and it's getting them over this barrier that's the really important thing for us as teachers. How do we add value to allow those youngsters to see over the barrier? As a school, I think, in fact, I don't think, I know from our results over an extended period of time that we're good. We are good at getting our youngsters over those barriers. Our youngsters, we know we've been in the top 10% of schools on a regular basis at both Key Stage 5 and Key Stage 4, that our youngsters do achieve, and we add value, and we're pretty good in terms of our equity, in terms of what we add, our equality to what we add. We enable those youngsters to move forwards. However, this is the reality of what we're seeing with different groups of youngsters within our school. And last year was no exception to that. Our very, very high achievers do very, very well. Our middle ability youngsters do well and are able to see the bigger picture and are able to achieve incredible results. However, there are groups, and they're different groups, and that's important to remember. There are different groups who have barriers, who sometimes dig themselves holes, despite the fact that we can give them great content, that we are good teachers, that we do have that equality of learning in terms of the information that we give youngsters, that hole becomes deep, and the extra bit that we add gets them out of the hole a little bit, but they're still not able to see the bigger picture. They're still not able to see the finalised results. So our programme this year is going to be about equity. How do we work with the different groups of youngsters that we have in the school? Here's an example. This is last summer's results. And last summer's results we take with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because there wasn't an exam, but this is what was being reported by us as a school. Yes, they are centre assessed grades, GCSE grades. Just have a look at the different results that we've got here. Overall, our youngsters were able to achieve that positive score, so that positive P8 score. However, if we look at our disadvantaged groups, our PP groups and our SEN groups, look at the difference. So we've got plus 0.69 to minus 0.36. Now, that's based on historical data, it's based on our judgments as teachers. We can have a look at English, maths, we can have a look at the EBAC subjects, and we can also see in the open pot there, we've got a big gap between different groups in that year group. The other group that we have a big gap in still, despite trying to start to address this last year with our work on differentiation, is the difference between male and female. And I understand the argument that people will be saying, yeah, but we were held back because we were told that they had to be roughly in line with results that we had in the past. And yes, I agree with that wholeheartedly. But still, our judgments show a gap. And that becomes very, very obvious when we start to look at the difference between our year 10s and last year's year 11s. So that's our current year 11s now and last year's. The group that have just left us had 115 girls, 127 boys, so we're boy heavy. That's unusual for Bishop Luffa. Our new year 11s are more like a traditional Bishop Luffa year group where there are more girls than there are boys, 125 girls, 113 boys. From our own assessments that we made last summer, looking at the year 10s, this is the type of thing that we were seeing. So here on this first column where it says total, this is the current grades that those year 10s have. If we compare it to last year's year 11, which is this column here that you can see the cursor moving on, you can see that last year's year 11s were arguably at a higher level and more able than our current year 11 are. If we look at types of gaps that are going on between males and females, have a look at the gap here. Here we've got 0.6 between males and females. Here it's more like 0.8. This is based on our current assessments. This is not historically based at all, our current assessments. So there is this definite distinctive gap between males and females in our new year 11 cohort going in. And we're going to find the same thing when we start to look at disadvantaged groups, when we start to look at PP youngsters, when we start to look at service, when we start to look at free school meals. So our current year 10s are here, and you'll see the groupings are in place. Our current year 11s, keep referring to them as year 10s, they're not, they are now year 11s, and last year's leavers here. And it's important that we go through this process of identifying what the gaps are with each individual year group. So it may be that it's boys and girls in that particular year group, and it may be in our new year 10s that we can identify that the gap is likely to be for free school meal pupils, for example, and it might be individual to you as a subject as well. So sitting down with your faculty teams is really, really important. Our focus is about equity this year. If this is the group that's causing you particular concern in a year group, then how do we scaffold the learning to enable them to see that bigger picture? What are we going to do? And I think scaffolding is a really important phrase that we use. Here are our really high achievers, the ones that come in with those high key stage 2 results, those that we know are going to do really, really well. We're not teaching them to any lower standard, but we're making sure that we have the scaffolding and we have the network in place to improve this group here and this group here. And remember, the group is individual to you as a department. So that's what we're focusing on, equity this year. So types of things that might help us with equity. I talked to staff last year about flexible pace learning. We have learned so much about new technology, so much about new programs, and now we need to start implementing those new programs and that new technology into our everyday teaching. You've heard me refer to the fact that we are going to have some youngsters in class, we're going to have some that can't access class. So the digital resources that we use are really, really important now. So the idea of utilising Google Classroom, please set up Google Classroom for every single one of your classes. Google Sites and flipped learning is going to be really important to us as teachers. So in order to produce that equity, focus as much as possible on making sure that those Google Classrooms are up to date. The verbal support that we give is really important. We can't wander around our classrooms as much as we have done in the past, because that social distancing is in place. So being very positive with our language is important. You'll notice right at the bottom here, I've mentioned collaborative learning. Collaborative learning in the past may have been groups of youngsters working together in a classroom, being quite close to each other. That's difficult now. That's far more difficult. So we need to think outside the box. How can we use technology to work for us in this collaborative learning. So we know that we can use Google Docs to share Google Docs with different groups of youngsters and then collaborate outside the classroom. We also know from lockdown that the vast majority, and we're not just talking about 60% here, we're talking up in the 90%, a vast majority of our youngsters have access to ICT outside of lessons, whether it's through their phones, whether it's through laptops, whether it's through pad devices. They have the access, and we have looked at school how we can make sure that everyone has access to digital resources outside the lesson. So utilisation of those digital resources is really important for us as teachers moving forwards. We know that ideally what we want to do in an ideal situation is allow our youngsters to see the bigger picture and remove the barrier. That's ultimately what we're trying to do. We know that youngsters are going to come in at different levels in the first place. We want them all to achieve at the same rate, but we want to remove that barrier. And that's what we're trying to do by producing this program based on equity this year. This year's program is going to be very much about research for members of staff and implementing what we research, what we develop as a department back into our everyday teaching. There are two things, please, that I'd like you to bear in mind for our CPD this year. So the first thing here at the top of the page is I've created a Google site which replaces the Frog site for our CPD training, and the Google site is packed with information. It's something that's ongoing. It's going to be a living, breathing tool in terms of it's going to be added to throughout the year. So your link for the Google site is at the top. I will send you an email with that link as well. The second thing that I'd like all members of staff to do, please, is to log into, as a student, our staff CPD training classroom. Now, the reason that I'm asking you to do that is it's a very simple way of me sharing information with all staff, but it's also a way of ticking off what CPD has been produced throughout the year. There's not going to be tests involved for teachers. I'm not asking people to sit tests to test what you've understood from the information. It's more of a check off. Okay, here is some training that I'd like you to do on Down syndrome. We have a new youngster coming into us in Year 7, Eddie, who will be joining us, who has Down syndrome, and I'll be releasing that training on Friday this week. So that will be released through the training classroom. So I'd ask for you all, please, to log on to Google Classrooms. I will produce a video for those support members of staff that haven't ever done that before. And I'd ask you all, please, to use the code R4CFIOL in order to log into that classroom, and then you'll be part of that classroom, and then I can release the first assignment to you, which will be on Down syndrome. A reminder that our program Map Master Move Forwards is our program for the start of the year, that we're very much constantly mapping where the youngsters are, checking on their mastery in order to move forwards with their learning, and being very, very positive about that throughout the year. The second part to our program is about equity, and equity may be different through different year groups, may be different for different departments in the school. So this is all about talking to one another within those departments, identifying where those gaps are in knowledge, where those gaps are in learning, and how we start to address equity of learning across the school. Really look forward, as I said right at the beginning of today's presentation, to seeing you back in school Thursday, Friday, if not the beginning of the week after, and saying hello to the new members of staff that are there, and welcoming back old friends. Thank you very much.